Welcome to the Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, and today we have a special guest that is joining us to discuss the FAA and the recent disruptions commercial drones and the emergence of AI has had on the organization. While the FAA isn't a traditional tech startup, the organization is interacting daily with technological advances. Let's speak with Mr. Nicholas Cardoza on how the individuals within the organization, as well as the organization itself, are handling these rapid changes and what they're doing to build some level of forward looking resilience and risk management. Nicholas, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I am genuinely excited to dive into this one. When I think about disruption, the FAA is a perfect, high-stake example of an incumbent organization facing massive, paradigm-shifting technological changes. It's one thing when a software company gets disrupted. It's entirely another when a disruption is happening at 30,000 feet.
Let's start with the basics for our listeners who might just know them as the people who delay their flights. Could you give us a brief history of the FAA? What exactly do they do? Who are their customers and how long have they been around?
Absolutely. The FAA, as we know it today, was actually born out of a tragedy. In 1956, two commercial airliners collided over the Grand Canyon, killing a total of 128 people. That event was the ignition source for highlighting the desperate need for a unified system to manage the rapidly growing national airspace. So, in 1958, Congress passed the Federal Aviation Act, in turn creating the Independent Federal Aviation Agency, which later became the administration under the Department of Transportation in 1967. The FAA's core mission is simple but incredibly massive: to provide the safest, most efficient aerospace system in the world. When you ask who their customers are, it's essentially everyone. Without aviation, many of the goods we consume on a daily basis may not be available, and if they were, they would be drastically more expensive. We're talking about commercial airlines, private general aviation pilots, cargo carriers, and most importantly, the flying public. For many decades, the FAA managed this airspace through a highly structured, rigidly controlled system. They relied on human air traffic controllers staring at radar scopes and talking over radios. They were, and still are, considered the undisputed masters of the sky, operating in a state of what Accenture's Disruptability Index calls durability: high barriers to entry and mature, efficient operations. Nobody was going to suddenly build a competing air traffic control system.
So they've been the masters of the sky for over 60 years, operating in what you stated to be the durable state. But recently they faced a new kind of disruption. Let's talk about the factors leading to this. Specifically, I want to look at the explosion of personal and commercial drone use. Was this disruption predictable, or how did it come out of nowhere?
That's where the disruption theory gets really interesting and frankly a bit predictable if you know what to look for. If we look at Clayton Christensen's model of disruptive innovation from our course materials, drones are a textbook example of a new market foothold. The FAA was built from the ground up to regulate large, expensive manned aircraft flown by highly trained professionals. Suddenly, you had affordable, highly capable unmanned aerial systems, drones, entering the market. These weren't being flown by traditional pilots. Instead, they were being flown by children, hobbyists, real estate photographers, and eventually massive delivery companies like Amazon. These users were what we would have considered non-consumers of traditional airspace in the past. That changed with the emergence and access to this drone technology. Was it predictable? Yes and no. The technology's trajectory was clear. Anyone paying attention to miniaturized sensors and battery tech could see it coming, but the speed of consumer adoption caught the FAA completely off guard. Returning to Accenture's index, the FAA rapidly shifted from a state of durability to a state of vulnerability. They still had high barriers to entry. Again, you can't just start your own rogue air traffic control company. But their legacy processes were incredibly rigid and were simply too slow to adapt to the technology that was evolving in months, rather than the decades-long procurement cycles that the FAA was used to. The threat wasn't a competing agency. The threat was the sheer volume of new entrants overwhelming their capability to regulate.
That rigidity must have made managing the crisis incredibly difficult when those drones actually hit the sky. Describe the actual disruption. What happened when these drones started filling the airspace, and what did the organization do during the crisis?
The disruption manifested as a direct, terrifying threat to public safety. The FAA's legacy radar systems couldn't reliably track these small, low-flying objects, and the human controllers were suddenly dealing with unauthorized aerial systems popping up in controlled airspace. It quickly became a crisis of near misses. Just to give you a frame of reference for the scale, by 2024, drones accounted for nearly two-thirds of the reported near-miss collisions involving commercial aircraft at 30 busiest U.S. airports. In 2025 alone, the FAA was receiving over 100 drone sightings near each airport each month, with total sightings surpassing 1,800 for the year. In some instances, there were commercial jetliners on final approach coming within 50 feet of consumer drones. The FAA's initial response suffered from what crisis management expert Ion Mitrov calls obliviousness to potential abuse. Because they had been so successful for so long managing manned aircraft, they assumed their existing frameworks would suffice. They were known to be painfully slow to act or to make any form of final decision or change. Eventually, when their hand was forced by the sheer volume of incidents and public outcry, they scrambled to implement Part 107 regulations, which required registration of drones over 250 grams and mandated remote identification transponders so that they could at least figure out who owned the drone. They were also partnered with law enforcement to track violators. But I am willing to bet that inside the agency, it felt very much like a reactive catch-up strategy rather than a proactive airspace management. They were trying to put out fires rather than fireproofing the building.
So it was a rocky start, to say the least. Looking at the recovery phase, how well did the organization recover from this disruption? Did it fundamentally change how they operate, or did they just slap a band-aid on it?
I would argue they're still in the recovery and adaptation phase, but yes, it has fundamentally forced a change in their operating model. The drone crisis was the writing on the wall. They realized that human controllers and legacy radar simply cannot scale to manage millions of drones alongside commercial aircraft. A human controller can only track so many blips on a screen before task saturation sets in. This realization has pushed the FAA to accelerate their next generation air transport system, or NextGen, and to finally embrace artificial intelligence. The FAA is now quietly developing AI-enabled predictive air traffic management systems, like the SMART initiative. The whole goal here is almost overwhelming. Use AI to predict bottlenecks and schedule conflicts hours before they happen. They want to move away from a reactive, human-centric model toward a predictive, machine-assisted model. Furthermore, they are exploring AI to automate drone traffic management, UTM, under 400 feet, essentially creating a digital, automated ATC for low altitudes. So yes, the disruption forced them to pivot from just being a slow-moving regulatory body to becoming a highly advanced data and technology integrator. They realized that if they didn't adopt AI, the airspace would become unmanageable.
That brings us to the final point, and I want you to be candid here. Give us your professional assessment. How well do you think the FAA was prepared for this disruption, and how well did they manage it overall?
My professional assessment is decidedly mixed. On the preparation front, they failed. They suffered from the classic incumbent blindness. They were so hyper-focused on sustaining innovations for their core high-margin customers, the major airlines, that they completely underestimated the low-end, new market disruption of consumer drones until it was almost too late. They lacked the disruptive processing and agile risk assessment teams needed to anticipate the threat. They assumed that their regulatory moat would protect them, forgetting that consumers can buy a drone on Amazon and launch it into the flight path of a 747 moments later, no training required. However, on the management and recovery side, I have to give them some much deserved kudos. Once the crisis reached a tipping point, they didn't just try and ban the technology entirely, which would have stifled American innovation and pushed the industry overseas. Instead, they implemented the Part 107 framework to create a legal pathway for operation and are now actively investing in AI to solve the human bottleneck problem. They are slowly, albeit painfully, transitioning their culture from one of a legacy process rigidity to one that recognizes that AI and machine learning are essential for organizational resilience in the 21st century. It wasn't pretty and took some serious bruises, but they are finally gaining altitude and seeing over the horizon. The real question is, will they be able to integrate AI fast enough to handle the next wave of disruption, like the autonomous flying taxis?
A fascinating look at how even the most entrenched government agencies have to adapt or face systemic failure. That's a great question to leave our listeners pondering. Nicholas, thank you so much for your insights today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to seeing how the FAA navigates this next chapter.